Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about guitar necks and specifically, is it possible to make a neck too thin? I'm also at the end of the video going to share with you a tip that I used to use all the time when carving necks to ensure that I could carve the back contour safely. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. But when it comes to the thickness of a guitar neck, there's really two factors that determine how thin you can make it. One is the truss rod. Because you have a slot for the truss rod that runs the length of the neck, it's the depth of that slot that will determine how thin you can make the neck. And typically, I like to make sure that from the bottom of the slot to the back surface of the contour, I have at least 1/8 of an inch, even 3/16 of an inch, just to make sure that it's going to be strong enough. Because if you make it too thin and you get too close to that truss rod slot, when you adjust the truss rod, you could crack the wood along the center line of the neck. The other problem is, of course, if you try to make the neck too thin and you continue carving away the wood, you run the risk of exposing that truss rod slot. And of course, if you do that, you've ruined the neck. Now, the other factor is really a factor that concerns the stability of the wood. The thinner you make the neck, the less stiffness the neck is going to have, and the lower the ability to resist string tension. And you can actually get thin enough to the point where as you're playing the guitar and you're pressing the strings down to the frets, you can actually kind of bend the neck a little bit, and it throws the strings out of tune, so the notes you're playing won't sound in tune. And I know a lot of guys who've had super thin necks have really struggled to try to keep the guitar tuned. They'll tune it, sounds great when it's tuned, but then as soon as they play, especially aggressively, the guitar doesn't sound in tune, and that's because that thin neck is just wobbling all over the place. It's like a wet noodle. Now, there are some things that you can do to improve the stiffness of the neck. And one of those things is to use wood that has a very high bending strength. And unfortunately, however, when you start looking at woods that have a really high bending strength or resistance to bending, those woods can get really expensive, and they also get really heavy. And so you can end up with a guitar that has, serious neck dive because of the weight of the neck. And another solution is one that I know people talk about a lot, and it's one that I've actually done it a few times, but I have come to the conclusion it's less effective than you might think, and that is to use carbon fiber stiffeners in the neck. And I see people using those all the time, especially in bass guitars. But I have found in my tests that it's not as effective as one would think. In fact, really the only way that I have found to make carbon fiber effective in stiffening a neck is to have a structure assembled out of carbon fiber and inserted into the neck. And there are structures like that out there, but they are incredibly expensive, almost to the point where it becomes impractical to use it on a guitar neck. But I have found that the traditional carbon fiber strips that you can embed into the neck just don't really do that much to increase the stiffness. And I know some folks out there are going to argue with me about it. That's fine, whatever. I just know that in my experience, it hasn't been that effective. When I make a neck, I can actually carve the neck to have a thickness, excluding the fretboard, at the first fret of about 1/2 inch, and that's as thin as I'll go. And I find that anything thinner than that runs the risk of exposing the truss rod slot, but it also greatly reduces the stiffness of the neck. So I try to keep my necks at the first fret to be about 5/8 of an inch. And then my necks taper along their length. So at about the 12th fret, it's going to be, excluding the fretboard, it's going to be about 8/10 of an inch, almost 7/8 of an inch thick. So that seems to work out pretty well, and I end up with a neck that's fairly light. It's very stable, and I think it's probably just fine for most people in terms of its thickness and how it feels in your hand. But there is one other way that you can thin a neck or make it at least feel like it's thinner without actually thinning it below that 5/8 of an inch at the first fret, and that is to thin the fretboard itself before you glue it on. And typically when I make a guitar neck, my fretboards at the thickest point at the heel are about 1/4 of an inch thick. Give or take a 1/100th of an inch or so, but it's about 1/4 of an inch. I can, however, thin the neck or thin the fretboard down from the backside. I'll sand off the surface that's going to be gluing to the neck itself. I can sand that down until the neck has a thickness of about just under 3/16 of an inch thick, or 0.1875. I actually can get it down to about 0.17 and not have to worry about exposing my fret slots on the bottom as I sand away the wood, because you don't want to do that. That's just going to weaken the fretboard during the gluing and clamping process. But by doing that, I can actually get my neck quite a bit thinner than it normally would be with a full thickness 1/4 inch thick fretboard. So it actually will make the neck feel thinner than it really is. But I mean, it actually is that thick, but it's just that you haven't thinned it by carving the back contour. Now when I'm making my necks, of course I'm using my CNC machine, and I create all the 3D files for the neck as well as the G-code. So I know exactly how thick this neck is going to be, and I know exactly what the relationship is going to be between the truss rod and the back contour. So that's not really an issue. However, in the old days when I was making necks entirely by hand, using a draw knife and spoke shave, I had to use a slightly different technique, and that's what I wanted to share with you, because I think this is a technique that you'll find useful if you're building guitars using hand tools. And the way it works is, the first thing I do is I take my neck blank, and this is a typical mahogany neck blank, and I'll draw a center line along its length. And then what I'll do is I'll figure out exactly where on that blank my first fret is going to be and where my 12th fret is going to be, and I'll mark those. Now, if I want my neck to be, let's just say for the sake of discussion, I want it to be a 1/2 inch thick at the first fret. Typically at the 12th fret, because I do a taper, I'll make that about 0.8 inches or 0.8 of an inch thick. So then what I'll do is I'll measure the thickness of my blank, and then I'll subtract that thickness measurement that's at the first fret and the 12th fret. So if at the first fret I'm going to make it a 1/2 inch thick, and let's say my blank is an inch thick, that's a 1/2 inch difference. So what I'll do is I'll take about an 1/8 inch diameter drill bit, and I'll drill a hole where I marked where the 12th or the first fret is going to be, and I'll drill that a 1/2 inch deep. Then I'll do the same thing at the 12th fret, except this time I'm going to take my 0.8 of an inch and subtract that from 1 inch, which leaves me 0.2 of an inch. So I'll drill a hole at the 12th fret 0.2 of an inch deep. And you can calculate hole depths between the 12th and the first fret if you feel the need to do that for accuracy. I found that it wasn't that difficult to do it, because you're only talking about that much of a difference in distance. Then what I would do is, when I would carve my neck, is I would use my spoke shave or my draw knife, and I'd start carving away the wood, slowly removing those holes. And as soon as the holes just about disappear during that carving process, I know I've hit the correct thickness that I want to maintain, and I won't have to worry about the potential of exposing my truss rod slot. So that's kind of a tip that I used when I was making my necks by hand. Well, that's all I have for this episode. I hope you learned something from it, and if you did, please, click the like button, leave some comments below, and if you don't already subscribe, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and when you do that, you'll see that little bell icon. And if you click the bell icon, and then make sure that your YouTube settings are allowing for notifications. Every time I post a new video, which is about once a week, you'll get a notification via email that the video is ready to watch. So until next week, take care and we'll see you soon.